In this video, I'm going to show you how to convert your machine from a 4-thread overlock stitch to a 3-thread narrow hem. There are 2 steps that I'm going to take. The first one is removing this needle plate that is for your standard stitching. Raise your presser foot, completely loosen this front screw only. Once you've taken that screw out, you should take your presser foot off the machine as well. You want to lift that spring just slightly and then pull the foot out of the way. This gives you the ability now to lift that plate off the machine, and you can pull your threads all the way to the back so that they come off of that stitch finger. Now that you have this needle plate off, this is a great time to take a look at the 2 and see the difference. All of your stitches are getting formed over this stitch finger that occurs here. Now, all I have left on this one is that small needle-like piece, and that's why your stitches can become fairly narrow. To replace this, I'm simply going to slide it back in the position that that other needle plate was in, and you're going to have to make sure that you lift up that little spring so that you can drop this into place, which should be fairly easy. That back screw stays in place, and you're just going to replace the screw here on the front. Sometimes it's best to start by counter screwing, and then it'll grab a lot easier. I'm going to open up the door in the front and also on the side, just to make sure that this piece gets down all the way. Now, when you're looking at the top part of this needle plate, you'll notice that there's a little notch here. And what you need to do is rotate your cutting blade knife so that it is in line with that, essentially making it into the narrowest position that it can go. Now we're going to put the foot back on, and it's going to be a whole lot easier to do that if you move the knife out of the way, which will then open up this area so you can see your spring. I'm lifting up on my presser foot at the same time that I'm sliding this forward. And once you have it, you'll position that bar underneath that shank, and then you can give it a little push on the back and it'll drop into place. I have my knife now back in place where it needs to be, and I want to make my second change, which is going to be removing my left needle. This is a stitch that's going to be formed with just your upper and lower looper and your right needle only. And I always like, if my machine is already threaded as a 4-thread stitch, to keep that thread in position so that I don't lose my needle. Once I've done that, cut your thread at the top of the spool and just raise your presser foot, and you can pull that thread towards you. Now the next thing I'm going to do is just run a piece of fabric through the serger, making my last adjustment, which is going to be moving my stitch length somewhere closer to the number 1. Now, the stitch doesn't always instantly look perfect. This is an opportunity for me to make some changes, or it really does give the threads a chance to settle in place. At the beginning of stitching, you're going to notice that I've got a little bit of looping here where my needle is, and I also have a little bit of looseness over to the side. It seems to have somewhat corrected itself over here, but to make sure, one of the things that I can do is tug on my right needle thread to make sure that it's actually in the tension disc. I'm going to run my fabric back through one more time, and if need be, one of the changes that I can make is increasing the tension on this needle so it doesn't loop. which that seems to have corrected most of that issue. So let's take a look at that stitch. What you're noticing here is that I still have a lower looper, I still have an upper looper stitch, and what's happening is this is just really a micro version of an overlock stitch that would have been a 3-thread, which we showed in one of the initial videos on this machine. So this is one narrow stitch, and you can actually, if you go to a single layer of fabric, make your stitch length closer together. And in fact, this is a beautiful finish on the edge of something like a dust ruffle or some decorative projects that you're doing, maybe the edge of a pillow or even the hem of a dress. Now you can keep your stitch length here at the closest setting or back it up a little bit. Okay, which is what I like to do. I think that looks like a beautiful stitch. You're noticing a big contrast between my thread and my fabric, which we do for video purposes, just so you can see the stitch itself. If you were really using this thread and you were doing something on the edge of the fabric, most people will try to match their thread color, but while you're just learning, it's a good idea to contrast it so you can actually see what the thread's doing. Now, this is just one of the stitches that you can do, and by manipulating the tensions on the machine, I can actually do what looks more like a narrow rolled hem, which is that I'm going to be pulling my thread from the top to the bottom. And if you've watched the video that we did that talks a lot about tension on the machine, this is going to make a lot more sense to you. So this time I'm going to begin by holding on to the edge of my thread as I introduce the fabric into the machine. You can use the chart inside of your instruction manual as a guide for how to set your tensions to get a perfect stitch. And it's a combination of either loosening your upper looper thread and increasing your lower looper thread so that you can achieve the look of having those threads come around and wrap to the back. And actually, as you're learning how to do this, it's not a bad idea to put 2 different colors of thread in your looper area so you can really see the change that you're affecting. Your machine has the ability to do 2 different types of narrow hem stitches. And so this time now, I'm going to match my thread to some fabric, run it through, and let's see how this stitch can really look. And I would say that that's a beautiful stitch. So your American Home Serger has the ability to do a lot of good stitches, and this is one you definitely want to put to use.